Good morning. I'm here to talk today about coronavirus. And for years, I've been studying oxygen. From the very beginning of my neuroscience studies, I've been following oxygen, what a healthy oxygenated cell looks like, and how it operates. So, I'm in the light of this coronavirus where everyone is dying from lack of oxygen to the entire body. I am following, kind of in a reverse transcription, what the coronavirus may be doing. In my neuroscience degree, the first one, I worked, began at the Krasnow Institute with some of the top scientists in the DC area. I also got in the lab of Dr. Jane Flynn, who studies transition metals. Now, oxygen interplays with those metals, and I've been following that for years. So we're looking at iron, calcium, zinc, copper, potassium that contribute to the formation of Alzheimer's plaques in light of low oxygen levels. So I've been studying that for years at a very detailed level. I also design music programs. I'm getting my PhD kind of in that, but my main interest all these years is oxygen. So lack of oxygen is killing people. This virus is incubating in the lungs, in the lungs, the ENT, the ear, nose, and throat, the nasal pharynx area, and the lungs, which is where aerosol or oxygen in the air hangs out, right? In the blood, it's surrounded by fluid. That's a different kind of oxygen and transport and delivery system. There's no virus in the fluid inside. It's all in lungs. It's all in the aerated aerosol. When we look at the origins of bats, and everything that these animals that this virus is coming from, their demands, their oxygen demands, are different from ours. And we can get more into that. So we are a very advanced biological being, and we have advanced through these powerhouses in the cell called mitochondria that eat oxygen. That's what these little things do. They have their own DNA, mitochondria. We have to look at what's going on with them in the coronavirus. So they eat oxygen, they poop nuclear fuel, and that's what enables the cell to go ching, 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 ching at a very high level. And so they are involved in the response to this coronavirus, and we're going to look at that. We're going to talk about that right now. I've been doing a lot of studying on it and looking at how oxygen is transported to these mitochondria and how that's being cut off by the coronavirus. So oxygen comes in two forms, O2. That means two oxygen are bonded together. And in the process of that bonding, they lose an electron. And that gives them a positive valence, which makes them dynamic. And I believe the virus is using that O2 dynamic to fuel, gestate, split, gestate. I believe the O2 enables it to multiply. That's very different from how embryogenesis, which I studied in Northeast Brazil. In embryogenesis, the first trimester, zinc and copper are the main operatives. No paramagnetism allowed, no iron or oxygen. That's why women are lethargic, anemic, and kind of stop breathing. And it's a very highly protected environment. It's kind of the opposite with this virus. This virus thrives on oxygen and incubates in our lungs. And that incubation creates a couple of conditions that stops our immune system, and the immune system doesn't even know it's being stopped. Resting state monocytes, they've just lowered. Something's convinced the monocytes that, go ahead, go somewhere else. We've got you covered, which makes me think that the virus is a pretender. It's a monocyte Trojan horse or monocyte pretender. And when the monocytes go, the type 1 IFN immune response is kept at bay. Nothing going on here. The virus is fooling those two important innate immune resting state processes while it's feeding on our oxygen that's coming into our lungs and keeping it from going into our bodies. And that's what's killing everyone. So there's a way to triage that. I believe it's with manganese. We'll get to that in a minute. So there's a science and foundational thing for everything I'm saying here, empirical science that grounds, for instance, the extra electron that iron has when it comes to pick up oxygen. It flips it off. And we need to follow oxygen. So if you look into the cell, there's a very unusual finding that these mitochondria who eat oxygen and spew out nuclear fuel so that we thrive, high oxygen, these mitochondria are swollen. They've been rendered inoperable. They're swollen with extra electrons. So remember, O2 has a missing electron. And when it comes into the system, the iron picks up the oxygen in a magnetic way. And so a single oxygen is paramagnetic. A double oxygen is a positive charge that is reactive. And these electrons are coming back and forth. What I'm saying is that the mitochondria are engorged with electrons, such so that their outer cristae are separated. And so they can't perform the function of ATP production. And this is especially so in people with comorbidities and non-athletes. Athletes having a super strong cristae, they bond together. So this and young people would have that too. You know, these tight young mitochondria, nothing's going to bust them apart. This would explain why the coronavirus may not be affecting these populations as much, because it is a mitochondria problem that is killing us. So let's see. There's more to this. Zinc is well established to get into the cell and bust open this coronavirus. So I'm going to talk about triage, prevention, and approach to a vaccine. So ear, nose, and throat. This thing gets in, it loves dry oxygen with this O2 valence. There's a loss of sense of smell in some people and a dryness, right? So it's that the olfactory neurons are fairly large and they regenerate, they mutate, just like the virus. The virus mutates, the olfactory neurons mutate. And so it gets into this ear, nose, and throat area and the nasal passages and destroys the sense of smell. It's in there reproducing. Zinc is able to get in there and bust this thing out of there. And they use chloroquine, which is established to get into the cell. It has a really gangly nitrogen terminal. I think that's how it gets in. Not an expert on that, but I've studied it at Hopkins. And so you put zinc and chloroquine, and the zinc gets in there, and that's one of the triages that the NIH and the CDC are putting forth. So I try to understand how and why that gets in there and why it makes a difference. So I'm very interested in a type of a zinc nasal spray, very little, because it is toxic, but sometimes toxic kills, and then you can survive the toxin, but you can't survive the virus. That's the problem, because you have to have oxygen. On the other hand, so these nasal neurons are large enough so that the zinc can maybe get in without the chloroquine and the nasal spray and stop this thing in its tracks before it migrates down to the lungs or lessen or attenuate the population that gets into the lungs. And the nasal neurons, I believe, also mutate. They regenerate every 3 some weeks. And that's why our tastes develop as we're older. Children don't like a lot of foods, but as we grow older, we prefer those foods. We adjust, and those neurons are helping us adjust. So they may be a way to reverse signal to other systems as far as producing antibodies, maybe. But they're large enough that zinc can get in, stop the virus, learn from what that virus has taught the cell, and generate information, maybe. So that's just from the last couple of days. But meanwhile, I'm looking at how to triage these patients. Right now, the ventilators are forcing air into the lungs and basically maybe feeding this virus. If this virus feeds on O2 and replicates from O2, they're finding that the ventilators make it worse. That all this oxygen they're pumping in the ventilators, they're trying to save the lives, but it's making it worse. And the more oxygen they pump in, the worse it is. Now, that could be because it's pumping the oxygen in and trying to pull out the carbon dioxide, and it's just sucking more fluid and lymphatic fluid into the lungs, and the lungs are just drowning. There's no oxygen transfer. So I can tell you all about how oxygen transfers in the lungs. There's a lot of surface area. This virus gets in and just eats up, causes all sorts of problems. And I kind of understand a lot of those problems, and I'm learning more each day as I, pursue this line of research. So what is the answer? Let's go back to mitochondria. They are the powerhouse of the cell. I've studied them for years, and wow, they have their own DNA. We had developed a symbiotic relationship with mitochondria many centuries ago, like probably millions of years, let's say. And so mitochondria help us fuel from the oxygen, and look at us. Look what we're doing. Yoo-hoo! We win. But oxygen has enabled us to do that. We can live 5-7 minutes without oxygen. We need it. It's a primary source of fuel for our survival, health, and thrival, and evolution within a human lifetime and over the human lifespan. We can live 7 days without water. We need water too, and we'll get back to that in a minute, because water has oxygen in it. We need water too, and we can live 5-7 weeks without food. We kind of reverse that. We eat all the time. We don't need to eat all the time, but we eat all the time. We kind of drink, we drink regularly. But we need to drink, we need to tank up with fluid every 5-7 days. We need to breathe, but we don't do it as much. Anxiety, stress. We're surrounded by plastic. We're not out there foraging and what's next, and where's the next meal? And our olfactory is a very important part of breathing and survival all these millions of years. It's just the last 100 years or so we've just been boxed in, and all we do is eat. Food is also a source of energy, but it's very tiny. It just gives a tiny amount, like one unit of glucose gives us maybe 2 extra units of fuel in the brain and body, and keep the system operating. Whereas 1 molecule of oxygen gives us 36. So let's go back to the mitochondria. They eat oxygen, and that's how they survive. They eat oxygen and they spew out this wonderful fuel for us. It's like yeast. They eat sugar and they spew out alcohol. Yeah. Everyone loves alcohol. Me too, but I don't drink. I'm not a drinking lady. I'm not a drinking scientist. So O2 is delivered to the mitochondria, or O. I'm trying to look at that right now. Where is this? So iron brings the oxygen. The hemoglobin is iron. Iron and oxygen co-localize. They're both paramagnetic. They stick to each other. They go down to the mitochondria. Oxygen splits off. The iron gathers an electron. That's this electron transport into the mitochondria and trips back to the lungs to get some more oxygen. So mitochondria also harbor calcium and manganese, not magnesium, manganese. So calcium enables cell function. So when the mitochondria are full of getting their oxygen and the chains going, they're spewing out calcium while they're doing that, so we can keep moving. We can keep doing our stuff. And I call it they enable what I call the DNA God, that everything just, flow and instincts and everything's working together and communicating and producing generating and growth and all those good things. Mitochondria give that fuel to let that happen. So they are our friends. So they have, and to make that happen, a lot of calcium. There's a channel that spews calcium out. Calcium. We can get all this stuff done. Now, under conditions of low oxygen, which is what this virus is causing, mitochondria also harbor manganese, manganese, not magnesium, manganese. And what manganese does is it splits oxygen from water. It does this in plants, and that's how oxygen is thrown into the air. It splits the O from the H2O. Splits it. Manganese is very dynamic. We could do a whole lecture on manganese. It's a fascinating metal. It's right beside iron on the periodic table, and together they're like, and they use manganese to split iron out of rock. That's how iron ore mining happens. That's the only way it happens. They have manganese flakes that are produced in certain areas of the world, manganese flakes that they put together with water. So manganese is going to be splitting the water, and it also goes in and can split the iron out of rock. That's just what it does. So what does manganese do? It bangs out, it has a very highly reactive relationship with iron. It can split oxygen out of the water molecule for plants, for fish, and in our cell, that's what it does. So if you have a stroke or something, or a concussion, and all of a sudden oxygen is cut off to the area, that manganese will spew out manganese. That mitochondria will spew out manganese. You can see it. It's very clear in science that if there's a bleeding in the brain, and the blood gets bigger and bigger and bigger, outside the ring of that blood and ischemia, there's a circle of manganese. The mitochondria are desperately looking for oxygen, and they do it by splitting the oxygen out of water molecules with manganese. So that channel for calcium, when they have oxygen, it's calcium, function. When there's low oxygen, when there's no oxygen, that same channel No calcium, it kicks out manganese because it has to have oxygen. So, and when it doesn't have oxygen, all sorts of things happen. And that's how you get plaque formation. The cell eventually, the mitochondria, in the case of the coronavirus, they're like engorging with all these unused electrons because there's no oxygen to trade off in the electron transport. There's no transport because there's no oxygen. Because this virus, I believe, is paramagnetic or using in fact, from what I can tell, I don't know. It may be using this positive valence of the O2 for gestation, and then anyway, it seems to be using up our oxygen. It incubates and thrives on our oxygen, and we die of lack of it. So manganese, what I'm hoping to suggest is possibly, this has to be tried very carefully, a zinc nasal spray to get into those olfactory neurons. Continue with the zinc chloroquine that probably needs to be aerated. This virus is only in the lungs and the nasopharynx. While ingesting, getting manganese into the system, hydrating and manganese, hydration and manganese, that will provide, at least a triage of oxygen to the lungs, not to the lungs, to the organs. It'll give the lungs a break. If the body's being, or if the blood is being perfused with oxygen, because the virus does not like the aqueous oxygen, apparently. At least the gestating one. There's more. There's more. Where there's causation, all you find is evidence. So nasal spray, nasal inhalant of zinc and the chloroquine to attack the virus, intravenous or non-pulmonary manganese, and possible oxygenated reperfusion of the blood. Stop the ventilators. And there's more. So zinc, talk to those nasal neurons. I think you can do it directly because they're big enough. And guess what? With these immune monocytes, where do they go? Got to look at the conformation of that virus. Is it imitating a monocyte? Is it faking the monocytes out and therefore lowering the type 1 IFN? And gosh, something I was going to say about that, but so the zinc activates enough. Oh yeah, the side effects of zinc are all the immune responses we want to kick that virus's butt. That's what zinc does. That's what zinc poisoning does. Fever, increased IFN, increased monocytes, increased, the response to zinc in the system is the immune response we want to kill this virus before it fakes its way and owns the and takes over the system, takes over our health. While manganese, aqueous manganese, is going to hold the fort, as it were, while zinc does its job. Thanks for listening. I think I'm right on this. Let's get to work, people. Ernie Barreto, Jane Flynn, Ted Dumas, John Cressman, Jim Olds. Come on, baby. Let's get to work on this. Other people, my Hopkins colleagues, let's go. I think I'm right. I think I've got something here. It's worth a shot. Can we do this, please? Love, 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 love. It's all good. And then, you know what I teach? Ultroxia. What can you accomplish on an oxygen gradient over the course of a human lifespan? I'm trying to show by example, and I'm trying to formulate and teach that. So this is good news, folks. We can learn from this science. We can learn from Northeast microcephaly. I'm basing a lot of this work on the studies I did with microcephaly. Iron and manganese is it's almost a polar opposite of what we need during gestation, and how that plays out. Okay, so let me get going with this, get this out to you. There are a lot of people dying. This thing is out of control. And I'd like to propose this as a working hypothesis, grounded. I've not seen anything to dismiss what I'm saying, or am discovering here. And we need to iron this out, maybe virtually. And it might be an answer. We already know that zinc works. We know that zinc and chloroquine together gets into the cell, probably because of this ganglion nitrogen terminal. I keep seeing that in things that actually get through the blood-brain barrier, get into the cell, have this ganglion nitrogen terminal. It doesn't surprise me if that's, the operative. But I can, oxygen, anoxia. The Nobel Prize this year was Greg Semenza from Hopkins. Hypoxia causes all illness, all of it. That's what Alzheimer's starts. The hippocampus is the last drop-off point for oxygen in the brain. When we are holding our breath in anxiety, stress, we don't even know we're doing it, but we are. That hippocampus is being slowly deprived of everything. In the Darwinian sense, good. You'd see something, you hold your breath, it's going to signal the hippocampus, and neurogenesis happens in an anoxic transient. Cancer happens in a anoxic as well. All diseases, all natural biological diseases, heart disease, you name it, anoxic. So anoxia is no oxygen, death. Hypoxia is chronic stress, illness. Mitochondria die, mutate, cells die, systems die, etc. Normoxia, sitting there watching TV, nothing's keeping you from breathing. Primoxia, exercise, right? Meditation, all these things that they have been established that address the risk factors. And what I talk about is ultroxia, just the understanding that you have to stay ahead of your breath before you get up. When you're awake, all that matters is what you do with the next breath. Before you do a big task or go for a big run, what do? You take 10 deep held breaths. And I can lecture on that ad nauseum. Thank you. Thank you for listening. This is a full half-hour lecture, conversation, plea to do something about this coronavirus and look at the role of oxygen. This thing uses our lungs as an incubator. What's in our lungs? Aerosol oxygen. Doesn't want anything in the rest of our body. What's in the rest of our body? Aqueous oxygen. Let's go. Thank you. Thank you for being my friends and colleagues. I love you all. really did.